There is a place on this earth where the water runs unusually deep, where the sky can change its mood without warning, and where the line between the known world and something far less certain has, for centuries, felt dangerously thin. It has no official borders. No government has drawn it on a map. No lighthouse marks its edge. And yet, sailors have known where it begins. Not from a chart, but from something quieter. A feeling, a stillness in the air that shouldn't be there. A compass needle that drifts just slightly in a direction it has no business drifting. We call it the Bermuda Triangle. Geographically speaking, the Bermuda Triangle occupies a stretch of the North Atlantic Ocean, a vast, roughly triangular region bounded by 3 points: the island of Bermuda to the north, Miami, Florida to the west, and San Juan, Puerto Rico to the southeast. Draw those 3 lines on a map, and you'll enclose somewhere in the region of 500,000 square miles of open ocean. Some estimates stretch that figure further still. The ocean, after all, does not stay neatly inside the lines we draw for it. What lies within those lines is not barren water. It is one of the most heavily trafficked stretches of ocean on the planet. A busy corridor for cruise ships, cargo freighters, private vessels, and aircraft. The Gulf Stream, one of the most powerful ocean currents in the world, cuts directly through it, carrying warm water northward at extraordinary speed, capable of erasing all evidence of a wreck within hours. The sea floor beneath is a landscape of staggering contrast. Shallow, Bahamian banks that barely reach a man's waist, plunging without warning into underwater trenches of extraordinary depth. The Puerto Rico Trench, which sits near the triangle's southeastern point, is the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean, descending nearly 28,000 feet into absolute darkness. It is, in other words, a place that the ocean has designed very carefully to keep its secrets. The name Bermuda Triangle is itself a relatively modern invention. It was coined by writer Vincent Gaddis in 1964 in an article for Argosy magazine, though the stories that fed that name stretch back far, far longer. Long before anyone thought to give this region a title, sailors who crossed these waters returned home, when they returned at all, with accounts that didn't quite fit the ordinary language of seafaring. Ships found drifting with full cargo and not a soul on board. Vessels that sent no distress signal, showed no sign of storm damage, and simply ceased to exist between one port and the next. Crews who vanished so completely that not a single piece of clothing, not a single scrap of wood was ever recovered. The legends accumulated slowly, the way sediment does, layer upon layer over generations. And then, in the 20th century, they accelerated. In December of 1945, 5 United States Navy torpedo bombers, a squadron known as Flight 19, departed from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on a routine training exercise. All 5 aircraft vanished. The rescue planes sent to find them vanished too. 14 men gone, without wreckage, without bodies, without explanation. It remains one of the most studied and most debated disappearances in aviation history. In 1948, a British South American Airways aircraft called the Star Tiger disappeared on approach to Bermuda. 25 passengers and crew gone. The cargo ship SS Marine Sulphur Queen, gone in 1963, with 39 men aboard. The USS Cyclops, a United States Navy collier ship carrying 309 people. The single largest loss of life in U.S. naval history outside of combat, disappeared in 1918 without ever sending a distress call. Each disappearance, standing alone, might be explained: weather, human error, the indifferent cruelty of open ocean. But together, layered one upon another, they form something the human mind struggles to resist, a pattern. And where there is a pattern, we reach instinctively for a story. The stories people have reached for over the years are remarkable in their variety. Some have spoken of rogue waves, walls of water 60 feet high that appear without warning and leave nothing behind. Others point to methane hydrate eruptions from the sea floor, great underwater explosions of gas that could, in theory, reduce the ship's buoyancy in seconds, swallowing it before anyone aboard understood what was happening. Electronic fog, magnetic anomalies, time distortions. Even in the more imaginative corners of inquiry, the lost city of Atlantis humming with ancient technology beneath the waves. And then, of course, there are the pirates. Because long before any Navy aircraft went missing here, long before the age of radar and radio silence and official investigations, long before anyone had thought to name this stretch of ocean at all, ships were already disappearing within it. Wooden ships, ships under sail, ships crewed by men who lived and died by the wind, who navigated by stars, and who sailed these waters during the golden age of piracy, when the Caribbean was the most dangerous place on earth to carry cargo. Some of those ships were taken by pirates, and some of those pirates were never heard from again. This is where our story truly begins. To understand why the Bermuda Triangle swallowed so many ships during the golden age of piracy, you must first understand the world those ships sailed in. You must understand what the Caribbean was in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, not as a holiday destination, not as a postcard, but as it truly was, one of the most violent, most consequential, and most chaotic stretches of ocean the human race has ever attempted to control. It was a world defined by greed and governed by wind. And the wind, in that part of the Atlantic, did not always blow in the direction men needed it to. Let us set the stage properly, because the stage matters enormously. The golden age of Caribbean piracy is generally agreed to have stretched across a period of roughly 80 years, from approximately 1650 through to the 1730s, though its roots sink much deeper and its echoes lasted longer still. This was the era of names that have since passed into legend: Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Henry Every, Charles Vane, Samuel Bellamy. Names that were feared in naval offices from London to Seville. Names that made merchant captains check their rigging and their prayers in equal measure before departing port. But to understand why these men and women thrived, and why so many of them ultimately vanished, you must understand what they were swimming in. Quite literally, the Caribbean in the late 17th century was the beating economic heart of the Western world. Spain had spent over a century establishing itself as the dominant colonial power across Central and South America, and the wealth it extracted from those territories was staggering beyond easy comprehension. Gold from the mines of Peru, silver from Potosi in present-day Bolivia, a mountain so rich in silver that the Spanish said you could build a silver bridge from it all the way to Madrid and still have enough left over to carry across it. Emeralds from Colombia, pearls from Venezuela, exotic spices, hardwoods, indigo, cocoa, tobacco, commodities that the European market consumed with an appetite that never once slackened. All of it had to get home somehow. And home meant crossing the Atlantic. And crossing the Atlantic meant passing through, or very near, the waters we now call the Bermuda Triangle. The Spanish solution to the logistical challenge of moving this inconceivable wealth was the floater system. The treasure fleet. Twice a year, enormous convoys of heavily laden galleons would assemble at designated ports: Havana, Veracruz, Cartagena, Portobello, and make their crossing together, in company, under naval escort. There was safety in numbers, or so the reasoning went. A lone galleon was prey. 20 galleons sailing in tight formation, guns run out and flags flying, was something approaching a deterrent, but the floater system had an unavoidable weakness built into its very design. And that weakness was geography. The fastest, most reliable route from Havana to Spain required ships to sail north and northeast, directly through the Bermuda Triangle. The Gulf Stream was not merely convenient, it was essentially obligatory. A ship that caught the Gulf Stream could add 2 or 3 knots to its effective speed without burning an extra ounce of canvas. On a journey of thousands of miles, that kind of advantage was not optional. It was the difference between arriving in Seville before hurricane season and being caught in open ocean when the sky turned black and the sea stood up on its haunches. So they sailed north, through the Straits of Florida, past the Bahamas, past Bermuda, into the open Atlantic and home, and they were followed every step of the way by men who wanted what they carried, the hunting ground. There is a particular kind of intimacy between a predator and its territory, and the pirates of the Golden Age knew the waters of the Bermuda Triangle with an intimacy that bordered on the spiritual, not because they loved those waters, but because those waters were where the money was, where the routes converged, where a ship, sitting heavy in the water with a full hold of silver, would pass within reach of a fast, lightly armed vessel crewed by desperate, capable men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The geography of piracy in this region was not random. It was calculated, studied, and passed down through the strange oral tradition of the pirate fraternity. Whispered in the taverns of Port Royal, Jamaica, scratched onto rough charts in the back rooms of Nassau's notorious drinking houses, shared between captains meeting at sea in that unlikely, almost collegial fashion that characterized the pirate world at its height. The shallow Bahamian banks were ideal hunting grounds. A large merchant vessel or treasure galleon, drawing 20 feet of water or more, could not safely navigate the shallow passages that threaded between the Bahamian islands. A small, shallow draft pirate sloop could. This created natural choke points, narrows and channels where merchant ships slowed down, where they were forced to proceed carefully, where a vessel waiting at anchor behind a low coral island could spring into open water and be alongside a prize before the merchant captain fully understood what was happening. The tongue of the ocean. A deep water channel running through the Bahamas, dropping suddenly to over a mile in depth, was a particular favorite. A pirate vessel could loiter in the shallows of Andros Island, almost invisible against the mangrove coastline, and watch the deep water channel for the silhouette of a sail. When a suitable target appeared, the calculation was swift and merciless. Speed, wind direction, distance to the nearest friendly port where the prize could be offloaded and sold. The whole transaction, from first sighting to boarding, could be accomplished in under 2 hours. And the Bermuda Triangle sat directly over the top of all of this. Nassau, the Republic of Pirates. To speak of piracy in the Bermuda Triangle without speaking of Nassau is to tell a story with its center removed. Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, was in the early 1700s the closest thing the pirate world ever produced to a capital city. It sat almost perfectly within the southern boundary of the Bermuda Triangle region, making it not merely a port of convenience, but a strategic base from which the entire shipping corridor between the Caribbean and the North Atlantic could be monitored and exploited. At its height, roughly between 1706 and 1718, Nassau harbored something in the region of 2,000 pirates, a figure that, in context, made it one of the most densely pirate-populated places on Earth. The harbor was wide and shallow, deep enough for pirate sloops to navigate, but frustratingly tricky for the heavier Royal Navy frigates that might otherwise have come to clean the place out. This was not accidental. Pirates chose their harbors the way chess players choose their squares, for defense first, opportunity second. The men who drank in Nassau's waterfront establishments, who repaired their rigging on Nassau's beaches, who quarreled and gambled and planned their voyages in Nassau's chaotic, rum-soaked streets, were sailing out regularly into the waters of the Bermuda Triangle. They knew those waters. They had hunted them. Some of them had nearly died in them, and had returned to Nassau with stories that mixed practical navigational knowledge with something darker. Accounts of weather that arrived without warning, of currents that behaved in ways the charts did not account for, of ships that had been separated from company in fog and were never seen again. The culture of piracy was, in many ways, a culture defined by disappearance. Men went out and sometimes did not come back. In ordinary seafaring, this was always a risk. In piracy, operating outside the law, pursued by navies, sailing in vessels that were often poorly maintained and inadequately supplied, the risk was multiplied many times over. When a pirate ship vanished, there was no official inquiry, no naval search, no investigation at Lloyd's of London. The ship was simply gone. The crew was simply gone. And the ocean, patient and indifferent as always, kept whatever it had taken, the ships themselves. It is worth pausing here to consider the vessels involved, because they matter to this story enormously. The merchant ships and treasure galleons that passed through the Triangle region were, by the standards of the age, substantial vessels. A Spanish galleon of the late 17th century might displace several hundred tons, carry 30 or 40 guns, and require a crew of 200 men or more to sail and fight. These were not fragile things. They were engineered for the demands of Atlantic crossing, thick-planked, high-sided, built to take punishment from both weather and cannon fire. And yet, they sank. They disappeared. They were lost with extraordinary regularity in the waters of the Florida Straits and the Bahamas, and the waters north of Bermuda. The pirate vessels were something else entirely. Speed was everything in the pirate trade, and the ships of choice reflected that priority absolutely. The sloop was the pirate vessel par excellence, low-sided, shallow-drafted, carrying an enormous spread of canvas relative to its hull size, capable of sailing closer to the wind than almost any other vessel of the period. A well-handled pirate sloop could outrun virtually anything afloat. In light winds, it could put out oars, sweeps they were called, and row itself out of trouble while a larger, heavier pursuer sat becalmed and furious. The schooner was another favorite, particularly later in the Golden Age. Two-masted, fore and aft rigged, the schooner combined the sloop's speed advantage with marginally more cargo capacity, useful when you needed to carry the supplies for a long voyage, or when you intended to transfer a substantial amount of plundered cargo into your own hold. These vessels were fast. They were agile. They were crewed by men who were, whatever else might be said of them, genuinely extraordinary sailors. Men who had grown up on the water, who could read the sky and the sea with an almost preternatural fluency. And even they, in the waters of the Bermuda Triangle, were sometimes swallowed whole. The environmental reality, what the Triangle did to ships. Before we reach the specific accounts, the specific ships, the specific crews who vanished in these waters during the pirate era, it is important to spend a moment with the environment itself. Because the Bermuda Triangle did not need supernatural assistance to destroy sailing vessels in the 17th and 18th centuries, the natural conditions in that region were more than sufficient on their own. The Gulf Stream, which we mentioned earlier as the great highway of Atlantic navigation, is also one of the great agents of maritime destruction. It runs north through the Florida Straits at between 4 and 5 knots, a powerful, relentless river within the ocean, carrying warm Caribbean water northward. For a ship running before it, northbound and homeward, it was a gift. For a ship trying to work southward against it, or for a ship caught in it during bad weather, it was something close to a trap. The problem with strong ocean currents and contrary winds is a phenomenon sailors call a wind against current sea, and it is genuinely terrifying. When a strong current running in one direction meets wind blowing in the opposite direction, the waves it produces are not the long rolling swells of open ocean that a 17th century ship could ride reasonably comfortably. They are steep, short, chaotic, waves that build to extraordinary heights for their wavelength, waves that break at their crests and fall almost vertically, Waves that can overwhelm a vessel not because of their size alone, but because of their shape and their relentless frequency. A ship caught in a wind against current sea in the Florida Straits, in the era before weather forecasting, before radio, before any means of knowing what was coming over the horizon, was in serious, immediate danger. The Gulf Stream was fast enough and consistent enough that such conditions could develop within hours of the weather changing, and the weather in the Caribbean and the Bahamas is famously, sometimes catastrophically, changeable. Then there are the hurricanes. We use the word casually now, surrounded as we are by satellite imagery and 5-day forecast tracks and color-coded storm warning systems. But in the golden age of piracy, a hurricane was simply the end of the world arriving without announcement. Barometric pressure dropped, the wind shifted, the sky took on a particular color. Sailors described it as a bruised yellow-green, the color of old copper, and then the storm was upon you, and whatever you did next was largely irrelevant. The Atlantic hurricane season runs from June through November, overlapping almost perfectly with the period when the Spanish treasure fleets were making their annual crossing. The timing was not coincidental. The floater system was designed to avoid the worst of hurricane season, but the coordination required to move dozens of ships simultaneously across thousands of miles meant that delays were inevitable, and delays meant exposure. Entire treasure fleets were lost to Caribbean hurricanes. The 1715 fleet, 11 Spanish ships, a fortune in gold and silver aboard, was caught by a hurricane off the Florida coast and driven ashore almost in its entirety. Over 1,000 men died. The treasure scattered across the seafloor in the shallows, where salvagers and treasure hunters have been picking at it quite literally ever since. For pirate ships, which were smaller, lighter, and generally less well-maintained than naval vessels, the calculus in a hurricane was even more brutal. Speed and low freeboard. The very qualities that made a pirate sloop so effective as a hunter became deadly liabilities when the sea rose and the wind exceeded 50, 60, 70 knots. A vessel that sat low in the water to reduce wind resistance in a normal blow would be swamped by wave after wave in a full hurricane, unable to climb out of the troughs before the next wave fell on it. And after the storm passed, the ocean told no stories. The wreckage dispersed. The Gulf Stream carried debris north and east, away from any coast where it might wash ashore and be identified. The deep water of the tongue of the ocean, the Puerto Rico Trench, the abyssal plains of the North Atlantic, they received what the storm had finished, and they kept it. Beyond the hurricanes and the currents, the Bahamas themselves presented a navigational challenge of extraordinary complexity. The Bahamian archipelago consists of roughly 700 islands and some 2,000 cays, low-lying, coral-edged, often barely visible above the waterline, until you were practically upon them. The waters between them were threaded with reefs and sandbars that shifted with the seasons, that were inadequately charted even by the standards of the time, and that caught ships with a regularity that would be almost comical if the consequences were not so uniformly fatal. Pirates knew these waters better than anyone, but knowing them and surviving them were not always the same thing. Blackbeard and the Triangle's Edge. No account of piracy in the Bermuda Triangle region can proceed without extended consideration of Edward Teach, the man the world would come to know as Blackbeard, and one of the most genuinely formidable figures the pirate world ever produced. Blackbeard was not merely a pirate. He was a strategist, a psychologist, and a navigator of exceptional skill, who operated in the waters bordering the Bermuda Triangle for the better part of 3 years at the absolute height of his power. He knew the Bahamian channels and the Florida Straits as well as any man alive. He used the geography of the Triangle region, its shallows, its currents, its tendency to produce sudden and dramatic weather, as a tactical asset in a way that few of his contemporaries could match. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a vessel of considerable power, a French slaving ship he had captured in 1717 and converted, adding guns until she carried somewhere between 40 and 46 cannon. She was not a nimble ship. She was a statement, a floating declaration that Blackbeard was not merely operating in these waters but dominating them. In the spring of 1718, Blackbeard executed what historians now regard as one of the most audacious operations in the history of Caribbean piracy, the blockade of Charleston, South Carolina. With a small fleet of vessels, he effectively sealed off one of colonial America's most important ports for an entire week, stopping every ship that attempted to enter or leave and ransacking them at leisure. The sheer brazenness of it, the territorial confidence it expressed, speaks to how completely Blackbeard had come to regard the waters between the Caribbean and the Carolina coast, waters that encompassed much of the Bermuda Triangle, as his own. But Blackbeard's story also illuminates something important about the Triangle's relationship with piracy, which is this: the very features that made these waters so useful to pirates. The complexity of the navigation, the speed of weather changes, the power of the Gulf Stream, the depth and disorienting sameness of the open ocean between the Bahamas and Bermuda also made them deeply, consistently dangerous, even for the best, even for the most experienced, even for men like Blackbeard, who had spent their entire adult lives reading the sea. Blackbeard himself would ultimately meet his end, not in the Triangle but off the coast of North Carolina, defeated by a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard, in a battle that was ferocious enough to pass into immediate legend. But many of the men who sailed with him, and many who sailed against him in those Triangle waters, were not so definitively accounted for. They simply, at some point, stopped appearing in the records. Their ships were not captured, their crews were not taken prisoner, they were not killed in any documented engagement. They were gone. Samuel Bellamy and the Whydah. The story of Samuel Bellamy and his flagship, the Whydah galley, is one of the great maritime tragedies of the Golden Age, and it is a story that begins and ends in the waters bordering the Bermuda Triangle with a completeness that feels almost literary. Bellamy was, by any reckoning, one of the most remarkable figures of the pirate era. Young, charismatic, unusually philosophical for a man in his profession, he was called Black Sam for his dark hair. He refused the powdered wigs fashionable among gentlemen of the period, wearing his own hair tied back with a black silk ribbon, which was simultaneously a practical choice and an ideological statement. Bellamy was one of those pirates who had developed a genuine, if self-serving, philosophy about what he was doing and why. A philosophy that positioned piracy not as simple theft, but as a response to the injustices of a social order that ground poor men into dust, while the wealthy grew fat on their labor. "I am a free prince," he is reported to have told the captain of a merchant vessel he had just plundered, "and I have as much authority to make war on the whole world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea and an army of 100,000 men in the field." Whether Bellamy actually said this, or whether it was elaborated by those who later wrote his story, is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that he was enormously successful. In the space of roughly a year of active piracy, he captured over 50 vessels, an extraordinary tally. When he took the Whydah galley in February of 1707, a large and powerful former slave ship, he had a flagship worthy of his ambitions. The Whydah was heavily armed, fast, and carried a substantial amount of captured plunder from dozens of previous prizes. Bellamy sailed her north from the Caribbean in the spring of 1717, intending to make for Maine, where he had unfinished personal business. A woman named Maria Hallett, who had been waiting for him in the village of Eastham on Cape Cod, and whom he reportedly intended to return to. He never arrived. On the night of April 26, 1717, the Whydah encountered a violent northeastern storm off the coast of Cape Cod. The storm drove her onto a sandbar in the darkness, and she broke apart within minutes. Of the approximately 145 men aboard, only 2 survived. Bellamy was not among them. The wreck of the Whydah was not definitively located and confirmed until 1984, when marine archaeologist Barry Clifford found her remains in 30 feet of water off Wellfleet, Massachusetts, the first fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever recovered. The Whydah's final voyage took her through the northern reaches of the Bermuda Triangle, through those same waters between the Bahamas and the New England coast, where currents and weather conspire with such lethal efficiency. The storm that killed her was not, in the strict geographical sense, a Bermuda Triangle event, but it was the product of the same dynamic Atlantic weather system that has always made the western North Atlantic, and the Triangle in particular, so extraordinarily deadly for ships under sail. What the Whydah's story illuminates is this: even the most successful pirate of his generation, commanding one of the most powerful vessels in the pirate fleet, could be destroyed by weather in these waters with no more warning, no more ceremony, and no more chance of survival than the greenest merchant sailor on his first Atlantic crossing. The ocean was not impressed by Samuel Bellamy's philosophy. The storm did not care about his 50 prizes. The waves off Cape Cod rose and fell according to their own logic, entirely indifferent to the ambitions and the humanity of the men beneath them. The Spanish treasure fleets, riches and ruin. While individual pirate vessels disappeared in ones and twos, the great Spanish treasure fleets demonstrate the Triangle's capacity for catastrophic wholesale destruction on a scale that still defies easy comprehension. The 1715 Plate Fleet deserves more detailed examination, because its fate and its aftermath speak directly to the violent intersection of piracy, treasure, and the Triangle's particular geography. In July of 1715, 11 Spanish ships, 10 treasure galleons, and 1 French vessel sailing in company departed Havana, carrying the combined wealth of 2 years' worth of delayed treasure shipments. The delay had been caused by the War of the Spanish Succession, which had made Atlantic crossings even more dangerous than usual, and so the 1715 fleet was carrying accumulated wealth on a scale that was, even by the extraordinary standards of the Spanish colonial system, remarkable. Estimates of the total value of the cargo vary considerably, but figures ranging from 14 to 30 million pesos have been cited in historical accounts, a fortune so vast that it is genuinely difficult to conceptualize in modern terms. The fleet's pilots advised against sailing. The weather was unsettled. The atmospheric pressure was dropping in the way that, to an experienced Atlantic navigator, suggested that the conditions would deteriorate before they improved. But the fleet's admiral, Admiral Don Juan Esteban de Ubilla, had waited long enough. 2 years of accumulated treasure, 2 years of commercial pressure from merchants and the Spanish crown alike. He gave the order to sail. They made it as far as the Florida Straits. On the night of July 30th, and into the early hours of July 31st, a hurricane of extraordinary intensity moved across their position. The storm had developed rapidly, which was characteristic of the July hurricane season in the western Atlantic, when sea surface temperatures were at their peak and weather systems could intensify from a tropical depression to a full hurricane in under 24 hours. The fleet had no warning adequate to its actual situation. By the following morning, 10 of the 11 ships had been driven onto the Florida reefs. Over 1,000 men were dead. The surviving sailors who made it to shore found themselves stranded on a hostile coastline, surrounded by wreckage, with the ocean still churning around them and the nearest Spanish settlement hundreds of miles away. The treasure lay scattered across the seafloor in relatively shallow water, some of it in depths of only 20 or 30 feet. Within weeks, word of the disaster had spread through the Caribbean with the speed that only genuine catastrophe can achieve. Spanish salvage operations began almost immediately, dispatching divers to recover what could be recovered from the wreck site. And the pirates came. Of course they came. A group of pirates based in Jamaica, led by Henry Jennings, descended on the Spanish salvage camp in August of 1715. driving off the guards and making off with a substantial portion of the recovered silver. It was a brazen, efficient operation conducted within sight of the Florida coast in water barely deep enough to float a sloop. But here is what matters for our story. In the months and years that followed, as pirates from across the Caribbean descended on the Florida Straits and the Bahamas, drawn by the prospect of salvageable treasure and the richly laden merchant ships still trying to make the Atlantic crossing, the disappearances multiplied. Small pirate vessels, pushing their luck in weather they shouldn't have attempted. Treasure-hunting sloops overloaded with recovered silver, sitting too low in the water to handle any kind of sea. Ships that set out from Nassau or Jamaica or Hispaniola toward the wreck sites and were never heard from again. The Triangle, in the years following the 1715 disaster, became more crowded, more dangerous, and more productive of disappearances than it had been at any previous point in the pirate era. Bartholomew Roberts, the most prolific, and the questions he leaves behind. No account of piracy in the Atlantic during the Golden Age can ignore Bartholomew Roberts, who was by any measurable standard the most successful pirate of his era, and arguably of any era. Between 1719 and 1722, Roberts captured over 400 vessels, a figure that places him in a category entirely his own. He operated across an extraordinary range of territory, from Brazil to Newfoundland, from West Africa to the Caribbean, and the waters of the Bermuda Triangle were part of the operational landscape through which he moved his fleet. Roberts is a figure of particular interest for this documentary, not because he disappeared in the Triangle. He did not, being killed in battle off the West African coast in February of 1722, but because the behavior of his fleet in the Western Atlantic raises questions that have never been entirely resolved. In 1720, Roberts operated extensively in the waters between the Caribbean and Bermuda, raiding shipping along the routes that passed through the Triangle's boundaries. During this period, several of his consort vessels, smaller ships sailing in company with his flagship, dropped out of the historical record in ways that are not fully explained. The pirate world was not a rigidly organized one. Ships joined and left pirate fleets with considerable fluidity. A consort that disappeared from Roberts' company might have gone independent, might have been captured by a naval vessel, and tried without the case attracting sufficient attention to survive in the documents, or might simply have been lost at sea. But in the waters of the Bermuda Triangle, the possibility of loss at sea was never a remote one. What Roberts' story contributes to this wider account is a picture of just how intense the traffic through the Triangle was at the height of the Golden Age. This was not a remote, rarely traveled stretch of ocean. It was one of the most heavily used shipping corridors in the world, and it was simultaneously one of the most dangerous. The combination of that traffic density and that danger level was the engine that generated disappearances at such a remarkable rate. Merchant ships, pirate ships, naval vessels, fishing craft. The ocean was indiscriminate in what it took. The privateers, legal pirates, equal victims, alongside the outright pirates. Those operating without any legal authorization, carrying the black flag or its variants. The waters of the Bermuda Triangle also saw the constant traffic of privateers. Privateers occupied an ambiguous middle ground. In the maritime world of the 17th and 18th centuries, there were privately owned, privately crewed vessels authorized by a government to attack and capture the merchant shipping of enemy nations. In exchange for a share of the prizes taken, they operated under a document called a letter of marque, which was supposed to distinguish them from ordinary pirates in the eyes of international maritime law. In practice, the distinction was often a matter of paperwork and timing rather than behavior. A privateer whose letter of marque had expired but who continued raiding was a pirate, legally speaking. A privateer operating against a nation with whom his sponsoring government had made peace was a pirate. The line was movable. and many of the men who became famous as pirates in the Golden Age had begun their careers as privateers, legal commerce raiders who found, when the particular war that had employed them ended, that they were not prepared to give up the life. What privateers contribute to the story of the Bermuda Triangle is important for two reasons. First, privateers were somewhat better documented than outright pirates. They operated legally. They registered their prizes in admiralty courts. Their losses were sometimes officially recorded. This means that the disappearance of privateering vessels in the Triangle leaves traces in the historical record that pirate disappearances often do not. And the record shows disappearances. English privateers operating out of the Bahamas and Jamaica during the various wars of the early 18th century simply vanished in these waters with a consistency that troubled the admiralty officials who tracked them. Ships that checked in at Nassau and declared their intention to cruise in the Florida Straits or the waters north of the Bahamas and were never seen or heard from again. The Admiralty, in such cases, had limited options. A search was not generally mounted for a missing privateer. The resources were not available, and the ocean was too vast. A note was made. An inquiry was dispatched to likely ports. If nothing came of the inquiry, the vessel was quietly entered in the records as lost at sea, and the matter was closed. Lost at sea was the 18th century's answer to mystery. It was comprehensive, it was final, and it explained nothing whatsoever. The law that built itself. Here is where we must acknowledge something important about the Bermuda Triangle's relationship to the pirate era. Something that distinguishes this period from later, better documented eras of triangle disappearances. The golden age of piracy did not produce a mythology about the triangle as such. The sailors of that era did not sit in Nassau taverns and whisper about a mysterious region that swallowed ships. They did not articulate their fear of these waters in terms of a specifically named, geographically bounded mystery zone. What they had instead was something more diffuse and, in some ways, more interesting. They had an understanding, shared widely across the nautical community of the Western Atlantic, that the waters between the Bahamas and Bermuda, between the Florida coast and the open Atlantic, were exceptional in their danger. They had specific warnings, passed from captain to captain, and from experienced hand to first voyage sailor, about the behavior of the Gulf Stream and the development of hurricane weather and the treachery of the Bahamian reefs. They had stories, countless, overlapping, often contradictory stories, about ships and crews that had gone into these waters and not returned. What they did not have, because the concept had not yet been constructed, was a framework that drew all of these elements together into a single named phenomenon. That construction would come later. It would come with the newspaper accounts of the 19th century, the magazine articles of the early 20th century, the books and films and documentaries that followed. It would come when the collective memory of centuries of loss in these specific waters was gathered up, named, and presented to a public hungry for mystery, but the raw material of the myth. The actual, documented, historically real losses accumulated steadily through the pirate era, ship by ship, crew by crew, voyage by voyage into waters that gave back less than they received, what the ocean kept. Let us end this section as we began it, not with a list of names and dates, but with an image, because that is what endures from this era, when the documentation runs thin and the paper trails go cold. An image built from the accumulated evidence of hundreds of individual accounts. Picture a sloop, a pirate sloop, perhaps 60 or 70 tons, carrying a dozen guns and 40 men. It is late afternoon in the summer, somewhere in the waters between Nassau and Bermuda, and the sky to the east has taken on a color that the oldest man aboard, a Bahamian-born sailor with 20 years of these waters behind him, does not like the look of. He has been watching it for an hour. He says nothing to the captain, because the captain is a decisive man and doesn't like his decisions questioned, and the decision has been made to press north. There is a prize out there, a merchant ship spotted 2 days ago and given the slip in a squall that they have reason to believe is making for Bermuda with a hold full of goods. The wind shifts slightly. The temperature drops slightly. The barometric pressure, if anyone aboard had an instrument to measure it, which they likely did not, is falling. The old sailor watches the sky and says nothing. By midnight, the storm is on them. By morning, the ocean is empty. Somewhere in the deep water north of the Bahamas, in that great blue silence where the Gulf Stream runs warm and fast and keeps its own counsel, the sloop and her crew and her guns and her captain's decisive confidence lie together in the darkness, settling into the sediment of the Atlantic seafloor. The merchant ship they were chasing makes Bermuda without incident. The merchant captain logs the voyage in his book. He notes the weather. He mentions briefly that they saw no sign of other vessels during the crossing. He does not know what he is recording. He does not know that he is writing a small, inadvertent epitaph for 40 men and their ship, which entered the triangle of water between his starting point and his ending point, and did not come out the other side. The ocean keeps what it takes. It always has. Part 3. The most notorious disappearances. Ships that the triangle keep. There is a particular kind of historical grief that belongs to the sea. It is different from other griefs. When a city burns, something remains. Ash, foundation stones, the shape of streets pressed into the earth. When an army falls, there are graves, or at least the memory of where the graves should be. But when a ship is lost at sea, the ocean offers nothing in return. No marker, no resting place you can visit, no physical evidence that the thing ever existed at all, in most cases. Just water, running over water, running over more water. The enormity of it is almost incomprehensible. The ships we are about to visit, some of them pirate vessels, some of them treasure ships, some of them vessels whose precise classification sits somewhere in the complicated middle ground between legal and illegal, that the 18th century Atlantic produced so abundantly, share this quality of vanishing without remainder. They entered the record, they left it, and in the space between those two events, the Bermuda Triangle did what it has always done. It kept them, the Jolly Roger and the last entry. In the archives of the Public Record Office in London, now known as the National Archives, there are thousands of documents relating to the administration of Britain's Caribbean colonies in the early 18th century. Most of them are unremarkable. Correspondence about sugar duties, requests for additional naval protection, complaints about the inadequacy of colonial governance. But scattered through them, like dark threads woven into ordinary cloth, are the references to ships that were lost. One such reference, appearing in a letter from the governor of Jamaica to the Board of Trade, dated in the second year of the 1720s, mentions a vessel known informally among Nassau's pirates as the Ranger, not to be confused with the ship of the same name later associated with Bartholomew Roberts, but a separate sloop, smaller and older, operating under a captain. The governor's letter identifies only by a surname, Navarrete. What makes the Ranger notable is not the vessel itself, but the circumstances of its disappearance, as the governor's letter describes them. Navarrete was known to the colonial authorities as a moderate operator by pirate standards, a man who apparently preferred to take prizes through intimidation rather than violence, who had a reputation among merchant captains for keeping his word when he gave quarter. He had been operating between the Bahamas and the Florida coast for approximately 2 years. In the summer of the year in question, the Ranger was observed by multiple witnesses, leaving Nassau's harbor heading north-northeast. 3 merchant vessels, passing through the Bahamas in the weeks that followed, reported seeing a sloop matching her description, riding at anchor near a small uninhabited quay north of Eleuthera, apparently conducting repairs of some kind. One of those merchant captains, cautiously giving the sloop a wide berth, noted through his glass that the crew appeared to be working on the vessel's rigging and that the ship appeared otherwise sound. After that sighting, nothing. The Ranger was never seen again. Navarrete was never captured, never tried, never hanged. His name does not appear in any subsequent correspondence. The sloop does not appear in any prize record. She simply steps out of the historical record in those waters north of Eleuthera, in the southern reaches of the Bermuda Triangle, and never steps back in. What happened to the Ranger in the stretch of ocean between Eleuthera and the open Atlantic to the north? The governor's letter does not speculate. It merely notes the disappearance as one item among several in a litany of piratical activity and maritime loss that characterized those waters in those years. A ship was there, and then it was not. In the context of the Bermuda Triangle, it was not even unusual enough to warrant a full paragraph. The Santa Cruz affair in 1750, after the formal end of the golden age of piracy, but within the longest shadow it cast, a Spanish vessel called the Santa Cruz de Tenerife departed Havana bound for Cadiz with a cargo that official manifest described, with the characteristic understatement of the Spanish colonial bureaucracy, as assorted commercial goods. Unofficial accounts, including a deposition taken in Havana from one of the vessel's junior officers several weeks before the sailing, suggested that the cargo included a substantial quantity of unregistered silver, the kind of silver that certain colonial officials had been quietly diverting from official accounting for personal enrichment. The Santa Cruz de Tenerife entered the Florida Straits and was never seen again. No wreckage was recovered. No survivors were found. No distress signal reached any shore. The ship and its crew of 63 men simply vanished in the northern Florida Straits, in water that sits squarely within the western boundary of the Bermuda Triangle. The subsequent investigation, such as it was, produced more questions than answers. Weather records from the period suggested conditions that were, if not benign, certainly not exceptional. Other vessels made the same transit in the same week without reporting significant difficulty. There was no evidence of pirate attack, no report from any passing ship of a vessel in distress, no bodies recovered from any nearby beach. The unregistered silver, if it existed, went with the ship, and the ship went with the Triangle. And the Triangle, as always, said nothing about the transaction. Anne Bonny, Calico Jack, and the waters. They knew to speak only of the ships that were lost is to miss something important. The lives that operated within and around these disappearances. The human texture of the world in which the Triangle's darkness was embedded. Anne Bonny sailed with John Rackham, Calico Jack, so named for his striped cotton trousers, aboard a small sloop that operated extensively in the waters of the Bahamas and the Straits of Florida. Rackham's sloop was eventually captured in October 1720 by a naval sloop sent out from Jamaica, found riding at anchor off the western tip of Jamaica with most of its crew in a rum-soaked stupor below decks. Rackham was hanged. Most of his crew was hanged. Bonny and Reed, both pregnant at the time of capture, were spared immediate execution. Reed died in prison of fever not long afterward, and Anne Bonny's ultimate fate remains one of the genuine mysteries of the pirate era. But what Rackham's story contributes to this account is geographical. His sloop had spent considerable time in the waters of the Bahamas, waters that formed part of the Triangle's southern boundary. And in the accounts of his voyages that survive in Jamaican Admiralty records, there are references to other vessels that had been in company with him at one point or another, or that were known to be operating in the same general region, that cannot be accounted for in the subsequent record. Ships that sailed with Rackham or in his proximity in the Triangle's southern waters and do not appear again. The network of small pirate vessels operating in the Bahamas in 1719 and 1720 was a dense one, and the attrition was constant, from naval action, from weather, from the ordinary violence of the life. Not all of that attrition can be definitively assigned to any single cause. The Triangle claimed its share, undocumented and uncelebrated, as it always had. The deeper mystery, what we cannot explain. We have spent considerable time in this documentary tracing the environmental and historical factors that explain, in rational terms, the extraordinary number of disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle during the pirate era. The Gulf Stream, the hurricanes, the Bahamian reefs, the inadequacy of 17th and 18th century navigation, the absence of rescue infrastructure, the deliberate concealment of pirate voyages from official record-keeping. These explanations are real. They are important. They account for a great many of the losses we have discussed. But there are cases, a smaller number, but a persistent one, where these explanations do not fully satisfy. Cases where the weather was documented as benign, where the navigation was straightforward, where the crew was experienced, where there was no obvious reason for the ship to be gone, and yet the ship was gone. It is worth sitting with this reality for a moment, without rushing to resolve it. In 1609, a fleet of 9 ships bound for the new colony of Virginia was caught in a hurricane and scattered. 8 of the 9 ships eventually reached Virginia. The 9th, a smaller vessel called the Catch, was lost entirely. No survivors, no wreckage recovered, nothing. The hurricane explained most of the fleet's ordeal, but the Catch was lost even by the standards of a hurricane that did not sink the other 8 ships. Something specifically and individually happened to the Catch that did not happen to its companions. This is the quality that makes certain triangle disappearances resistant to easy explanation. Not that unusual things happened, but that unusual things happened selectively. That a particular vessel, in conditions that other vessels survived, did not survive. That a particular ship, on a route that other ships navigated safely, failed to arrive. The individualism of the loss, the specificity of it, the way it points, sometimes, not at general environmental factors, but at something that happened to this ship, in this place, at this moment, that we cannot reconstruct from the available evidence. The ocean has always been very good at making specifics disappear. What remains, in case after case, is the broad outline. A vessel entered a region and did not leave it. 300 years of counting. By the time the golden age of piracy drew to a close, marked conventionally by the hanging of Bartholomew Roberts' surviving crew in Cape Coast Castle in 1722, though the process was gradual rather than sudden. The Bermuda Triangle had already accumulated an extraordinary ledger of losses: Spanish treasure galleons, English merchant brigs, French privateers, Portuguese fishing vessels, and pirate ships of every type and national origin, crewed by men from every corner of the Atlantic world and beyond. The counting continued after the pirates were gone. The 19th century added its own entries to the ledger, most famously the Mary Celeste in 1872, found adrift and intact between the Azores and Gibraltar with not a soul aboard, cargo untouched, captain's log maintained to within days of her discovery, the mystery of her abandoned crew never resolved. The 20th century added Flight 19, the Cyclops, the Marine Sulphur Queen, the Star Tiger and Star Ariel. Aircraft as well as ships now, because human ambition had expanded the theater of potential loss to include the sky above the triangle as well as the water within it. And through all of it, through 300 years of documented loss, through every technological advance that gave sailors and pilots better tools, better forecasts, better communications, the triangle maintained its accounting, reduced certainly by all of those advances. Modern navigation, modern weather satellites, modern distress beacons. These things have genuinely diminished the triangle's harvest, but never to zero, never to nothing. The ocean that swallowed Neverett's sloop and Bellamy's Wider and the Santa Cruz de Tenerife and 100 unnamed pirate vessels in the Golden Age still swallows ships today. Less frequently, with less impunity, but the debt is never fully settled, what the triangle actually is. We have arrived, at the end of this journey, at the question that underlies everything we have examined, the question that the Bermuda Triangle has always ultimately posed, not just to historians and oceanographers and investigators, but to something deeper in the human character, something that responds to mystery, not with the irritation of the unsatisfied intellect, but with a kind of reverence. What is the Bermuda Triangle actually? The skeptical answer is straightforward and, in its way, entirely correct. The Bermuda Triangle is a statistical artifact, a region of ocean that appears to have an unusual number of disappearances because an unusual number of ships have passed through it over the centuries, combined with environmental factors that genuinely do make it more dangerous than average ocean, combined with the human tendency to notice and remember and accumulate accounts of the unusual, while allowing the routine to pass unrecorded. The Triangle is real as a geographical region. Its reputation for danger is real, in the sense that real things caused real losses there. The supernatural explanation, the Atlantean energy crystals, the alien technology, the dimensional portals, is not real, or at least there is no evidence that it is real. And yet, the skeptical answer, correct as it is in its particulars, does not entirely account for what the Triangle has meant to the people who sailed through it, feared it, vanished in it, or spent their lives trying to understand it. It does not account for the specific quality of the fear it produces, not the rational, manageable fear of a known danger that can be prepared for and mitigated, but the older, stranger fear of a place where the ordinary rules of things do not seem to fully apply, a place where ships go in and do not come out, not always for reasons that satisfy the analytical mind. The pirates knew this fear. They did not name it the Bermuda Triangle. They probably would have dismissed the concept as a landsman's abstraction, an attempt to impose a comforting geometric framework on something that was too fluid and too vast to be contained in any shape. But they knew the waters. They knew the ways those waters could kill you. And they knew, the experienced ones, the ones who had spent years in those channels and those straits and those open stretches of North Atlantic, that those waters sometimes killed you in ways that couldn't quite be pinned down afterward. That knowledge is old. It is as old as the first canoe that pushed out from a Caribbean island and turned north into waters that looked navigable and were not. It predates the Golden Age by centuries, possibly by millennia. The Bermuda Triangle has been the Bermuda Triangle for as long as people have been trying to cross it. The name is modern. The reality is ancient. An ending at the water's edge, we have traveled a long distance together in this documentary. We have walked the quays of Nassau and the docks of Havana. We have stood on the deck of a rolling sloop in the Florida Straits as the sky changed color and the old sailor watched the eastern horizon with eyes that had seen this before. We have read the letters of anxious colonial governors and the sparse, careful depositions of merchant captains who escaped with their lives and their cargoes from pirates who, weeks later, were gone. We have not resolved the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle. No documentary can do that, and this one has not attempted to. What we have tried to do across these hours is something perhaps more valuable, to restore the human scale of what the Triangle has taken, to resist the tendency of mystery to abstract itself, to become pure concept, and to remember instead that every disappearance we have discussed was a ship crewed by people. People with names, with histories, with places they came from and places they intended to reach. People who ate and drank and quarreled and made plans for what they would do when the voyage was finished. The pirates were not heroes. History has sometimes been too romantic about that, and it is worth being clear-eyed. They were often violent men operating outside any law, taking by force what others had earned or were transporting at enormous risk. Their world was brutal, and they were frequently brutal within it. But they were human, completely and entirely human. and they were swallowed by the same ocean that has swallowed everyone else who challenged these waters. The Bermuda Triangle did not discriminate. It took the treasure ship and the pirate sloop alike. It took the naval vessel and the merchant brig. It took the experienced captain and the first voyage sailor. It took them in storms and in calm. It took them in the blazing clarity of a Caribbean afternoon and in the impenetrable darkness of a mid-Atlantic night. It took them and gave nothing back. Not their bodies, not their ships, not any explanation that subsequent investigation could fully satisfy. That is ultimately what the Bermuda Triangle is. Not a portal, not an anomaly, not a supernatural event waiting for a scientific explanation. It is the ocean, doing what the ocean has always done, taking what enters it, keeping what it takes, and somewhere in the deep blue darkness north of the Bahamas, where the Gulf Stream runs warm and swift and the seafloor is far beneath the reach of any light, there are pirate ships, sloops and schooners and brigantines, settling quietly into the sediment of the Atlantic, their cannon rusted to nothing, their rigging long dissolved, their flags, black or otherwise, gone decades after the last wood rotted away. Their crews are there too, in whatever form. 300 years of ocean floor have left them. Men who sailed out of Nassau on a summer morning, men who felt the wind in the rigging and smelled the salt, and were, for that one moment before the sky changed, exactly where they intended to be. They did not intend to stay. The ocean had other plans. The sea is not a place, it is a condition, and the Bermuda Triangle is the sea at its most honest, vast, indifferent, and ancient beyond any human reckoning. We name it, we map it, we study it, and it continues, patient and unhurried, to be exactly what it has always been. We thank you for sailing with us.